Hey, DawgNation, I'm Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Meriwether and Tharp, and as you can see, we're remembering the life of Charlie Trippi. We're going to talk more about Mr. Trippi before the show is done today. 100 years of life well lived for him, and yesterday you may have been aware of his passing, and we'll remember that life and celebrate the legacy. One of the greatest athletes to ever come through the University of Georgia, and a guy who has truly can say that he achieved excellence in a number of fields, even beyond the world of sports. So we'll obviously talk about that before we're done on today's program. We will also kind of get into it before we're all said and done here. Some news from yesterday that some of y'all had kind of wanted me to talk about. At the time, I didn't really feel like it was appropriate yesterday. Now it maybe seems more appropriate. We'll kind of get into that here before we're done. But the main thing off the top here, there is a lot of chatter about how Georgia should use its off week or how Georgia's mindset should be. Clearly, the Alabama-Tennessee game was one of the most talked about games in recent SEC history that got played last Saturday, and it has gotten Georgia fans talking about the game 3 weeks from now against the Vols. But then some Georgia fans are left to say, well, what does that mean for Florida coming up in 2 weeks' time? Well, guess what? We're going to give you a chance today to get a lot of, I would say, insider-type information, or certainly opinions from the inside about how exactly Georgia can go about being ready for Florida while also being ready for what comes after Florida there as well. Some of this coming from Kirby Smart, some of this coming from a former Georgia star, and if you're a Georgia fan who's getting a little worried about the cocktail party because you think there's been too much talk about Tennessee, let me give you some strong words of comfort before today's show is done. So all of this is coming up. Terence Edwards stops by there as well. We are really glad to have you with us for it. As DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Meriwether and Tharp, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Meriwether and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So by now you guys kind of know what the story has been here over the course of the last few days. We've obviously spent a lot of time talking about it on this show, that this past Saturday we saw one of the most memorable games in recent SEC history. And it was the kind of thing that had Athens transfixed because when the Georgia-Vandy game ended, the Alabama-Tennessee game was just sort of building to its most significant moments, and Georgia fans were watching it, I'm talking about with glued eyes to that screen to sort of see how that played out, and you've heard us talk about that. Many of you were there on hand to be able to experience that. You know what that was. And, in fact, the really significant chatter from this game continues. We have more on that today later on about a pretty serious situation that seems to be unfolding in the aftermath of that Alabama-Tennessee game, which we will get to today. But for some other Georgia fans, there's a little bit of anxiety about this. There's a little bit of thought of, oh my gosh, there's too much talk about Georgia-Tennessee. There's not enough talk about Georgia-Florida. And we've said on this show here that if anybody is going to make sure the focus stays on those, as we like to call them, lousy, stinking Gators, and the rivalry that we believe that matters the most for Georgia in every year, the Georgia-Florida game, you better believe our show is going to take full responsibility. Eddie the Blind Squirrel wouldn't let us do other than that. Of course we're going to be doing that around here. We just believe that a good Georgia fan is a Gator hater first and foremost. So you better believe we're lock solid, just locked in, rock solid on what's going to happen between Georgia and Florida. But we also believe this. There's kind of a way to do it all, right? That just because you are looking ahead to what's going to happen beyond Florida does not mean that you are looking past Florida. I want to kind of talk about that here a little bit and kind of tell you what Kirby Smart has said about that and what maybe other folks connected to the program have kind of said about that there as well. Because when Kirby Smart met with reporters on Tuesday night to open his only weekly press conference he was doing with the local media here this week, he kind of gave you a little bit of an assessment of what they're doing here right now. And he said something a couple of times that actually kind of ties back into something that we talked about last week of, how you use this time to both get ready for what's happening right now, but also to get ready for what's going to happen in the future. Here's the first one from Kirby Smart on the schedule for the Dogs this week.
Sunday was recovery day off. We didn't see the guys. They had treatment, but we didn't see them. And then Monday was a recovery day that we put the game to bed and looked at future opponents and did some walkthrough stuff and got them out of here a little bit, get a little freedom. And then today we went back to work and had some good work today. I thought the guys had a really good attitude, took on some more opponents for the future, and we've been preparing mostly as a coaching staff on things we got coming up.
So if you wanted to do like a really great like clickbait headline, you could say something to the effect of, Kirby Smart admits to looking past Florida, because right there he just said we're looking ahead to future opponents. And as I said before, there is a little bit of anxiety for some Georgia fans that creeps in, because we have been raised by the voices of Larry Munson and Vince Dooley, who would kind of get us believing that every opponent must always be fully respected. In fact, you have to exaggerate that opponent's strengths as a way of making sure you don't look past them. There is that just level of anxiety that creeps in of, oh, we've seen weird things happen between Georgia and Florida before. We've seen, the wrong team win, kind of on both sides of this rivalry maybe at certain points in times over the years, that Jacksonville is just sort of this weird place where sometimes weird things can happen. And there is, for some Georgia fans, a little bit of nervousness that might creep in when Kirby Smart opens his press conference on Tuesday. Kirby Smart, of all people, the most buttoned up and professional of all coaches, when he opens up his press conference saying we're looking ahead to some future opponents, looking past Florida, looking ahead beyond the Gators. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. That just because you're looking ahead doesn't mean you're looking past. And Kirby was even asked about that. Hey, what do you mean looking ahead? What do you mean looking at future opponents? You got a game coming up against Florida. What does it mean to look ahead to these future opponents? And Kirby Smart on Tuesday talks some more about that.
No, we try to work on all of them. We don't have enough time. We only got 3 days, so we assign out to the staff every team. And then they give a presentation to the rest of the staff on that team, what they might be doing new from this summer and anything new they're doing this year that we might need to prepare for. Then if anything's an oddity or it's really different, then we work on it today and tomorrow, and then we start towards Florida on Thursday.
So an important detail that's not as interesting as what people sort of perceive as the big picture here. When Kirby talks about looking ahead, the vision we all have in our mind is him looking to the thing that we're all looking at. Because let's face it, I am really interested in the Georgia-Tennessee game. I really am. I've talked to Chip Towers about this yesterday on our show. I think just measurably, this is the biggest home game in Sanford Stadium history. I told you that once Tennessee beat Alabama on Saturday, I didn't sleep very good that night. I think I was already getting really, really excited about what I think Dogs Vols has a chance to be on that first Saturday in November. And so knowing those feelings are kind of already kind of bubbling up in me a little bit, even though I'm admittedly going to try to really make sure folks stay focused on Georgia, Florida prior to that, there's a lot of energy about that Georgia-Tennessee game that is undeniable. And so when we all kind of know that, and when you hear Kirby Smart then also saying, we're looking ahead to future opponents, I think it's easy to imagine that he's only talking about Tennessee. But the truth is, that's not the case. When we addressed this topic a week ago, and we were, certainly talking a lot about this last Tuesday, I believe it was, when we were addressing this a week ago, it wasn't just Tennessee that we were mentioning there in that regard. The truth is that Mississippi State is a very different kind of team, the Mike Leach offense, very different kind of team than you normally face on a week-to-week basis. Alabama's going to play Mississippi State this week. I think you'll see Alabama play Mississippi State different defensively than they play just about anybody else. In fact, most teams, I think, would say that they take a different defensive approach to facing Mississippi State than they do against anybody else. We talked last week, or remember about this, kind of comparing it to triple option a little bit in the same way. You have to have that sort of, gap soundness and patience, and Kirby kind of made that comparison, that's kind of what it comes when you face Mississippi State. That's a team that Georgia's going to see in a few weeks. So when some of Kirby Smart kind of talks about future opponents, it's not just the looming showdown against Tennessee, but it's also a very weird kind of offense in Mississippi State. Tennessee is a weird offense, too, compared to what you normally see, and we've addressed that before there as well. But Tennessee's not the only, air quotes here, weird offense that Georgia's about to face. Mississippi State's probably in that category there as well, and after you beat Tennessee, it's going to be really important to beat the rest of these teams, too, which means taking a little bit of time to get ready for that. And even beyond that, way less interesting, but Kentucky has a different offensive coordinator than they had last year. Paying attention to how they may be different, at least worth your time. When you have an army of analysts, you got to give them something to do. Why not look ahead to Kentucky? Georgia Tech, who's probably the worst team, certainly the worst team that Georgia has left in its schedule, and among the worst teams that Georgia's going to play all year long. They do have an interim coach. They seemingly have played better since then. Are they doing things different now under Brent Key than they did under Jeff Collins? I'm sure that Kirby Smart will spend some time kind of working on all that there as well. But all of that is way less interesting than the idea of getting ready for Tennessee and getting ready for a game in which the secondary market, my gosh, I think the cheapest tickets I've seen are around $500 right now. And if you go on some of these secondary ticket websites, you see, 4-digit prices on a lot of these tickets here right now. And so the energy would seem to be built around Georgia is getting ready for the showdown against the Vols. But as I said before, this doesn't have to be anything weird. This doesn't have to be anything reckless. This doesn't have to be done at the expense of getting ready for the game that comes next. In fact, we told you last week that there's been enough circumstantial evidence over the course of this year and previous years to say that what Georgia's doing right now, looking ahead to future opponents, is the kind of thing that Georgia does on a fairly regular basis. So it leads to an honest and authentic question. Well, how does Georgia stay focused on the now, as Kirby Smart said before, being where your feet are, what's important now, WIN? How does Georgia stay focused on the now while also thinking ahead to the future? This is something that, first of all, that all successful people do, but in Georgia's case specifically, how do you stay focused on what's important now? You've heard Kirby Smart say that a million times, while also being aware of what will be important coming up in a couple of weeks or another month or another year. How do you do both at the same time? Well, this is where something really interesting happened last week. We had the great former Georgia star, Jake Fromm, who's not only a former star player for Georgia, but also a really, I think, measured voice, very, very intelligent with the way he talks about the game. We obviously celebrated good news for Jake this week, being picked up by the Washington Commanders, so we're happy for him. But he was with us on the show last week. And so I asked Jake, hey, how do you do this? How do you or can you look ahead to future opponents? Now, it's fair to point out Jake's a quarterback. He's working with the offense. We're right now kind of mostly talking about the defense, stopping some of these offenses that Georgia's going to play. But when Kirby says, hey, we're going to work some on future opponents, how do you do that? Because we're led to believe it's not just off week that Georgia's done that. You've kind of done that a lot throughout the season, and you did that before the season began. And you've done that not just this year, but previous years. And for years, Georgia has kind of spent some time, apparently, getting ready for future opponents. So how do you do that without getting the team to lose sight of what the next thing that's going to happen is? And this is where Jake Fromm stepped up and, by his own admission, revealed some secret information. Now, I say that half jokingly because this isn't anything bad. This isn't any, this is certainly not a nuclear code here, but it is a little bit of insight behind the scenes about how a team like Georgia might get ready for what's coming next without losing sight of what's happening right now. This is very good stuff from Jake Fromm. Take a listen to this.
The way Coach Smart does it, and I hate to even kind of bring out a few of his secrets, he'll hide it kind of in the schedule without letting the guys kind of know what it is, so that you'll see some yeah, I know. I'm releasing some good secrets here, but they'll do some good on good, and they'll call it a fastball or a NASCAR period.
Sure.
Excuse me. And so there'll be good on good, going fast. Usually they do it a couple times a week at the beginning of practice, kind of get everybody loose. But I guarantee you there'll be a good on good period mixed in this week, obviously, and next week too. Those fastball periods to get guys in shape, thinking fast, being able to communicate as quickly as possible, and then executing as well. So I would not be surprised if a few of those periods are mixed in even this week as well.
So Kirby Smart gets Georgia ready for future opponents the same way my wife gets my kids take their vitamins or their medicine or whatever else. You just sort of mix it with something else, and you mix it in with enough stuff, and maybe they don't quite realize what it is that they're doing. You call it good on good. You call it NASCAR. You call it fastball, and you just sort of do it in the midst of what's already a pretty high-paced, fast, paced practice, and you do it. You move on to something else, and you don't really realize, oh, that's the way that Tennessee's going to play us, or oh, that's the way that Mississippi State's going to play us. You don't have to say, we're getting ready for Tennessee. You just get ready for what Tennessee does. You don't have to say, we're getting ready for Mississippi State. You just get ready for what Mississippi State does. And same thing for any other opponent that might have kind of been in that category in previous years. I do think that's really interesting from Jake Fromm describing exactly how that goes on. That just because you're looking ahead doesn't mean you're looking past. I mean, Kirby Smart's told us a million times, they don't even want to look past the off week. Billy Napier, for what it's worth, also said something similar yesterday. He didn't even want to talk about Georgia until it got to be Thursday of this week. They were trying to follow, as he calls it, their off week process. Well, to a certain extent, Georgia's kind of the same way on that too. They are very, very careful not to look past whatever's happening right now. But successful people in life are always looking ahead. Successful people in life are always planning for the future, whether the future is next year or next week. That's just part of being successful. And you better believe Georgia wants success in the game against Tennessee or the game that's going to come after that. And so doing some preparation for that is important. And yet for some Georgia fans, it still circles back around to, yeah, but what about Florida? Well, I think there's a very clear answer to the question of what about Florida. And I think if you are concerned about that at all, I think you have a reason not to be. I'm going to tell you about it, but first, let's introduce the show. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Merriweather and Tharp, and we're happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us today. Live on video, 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app. 10 a.m. after that, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, Radio Noon, App and Sports Radio 96 The Ref, podcast, Apple, Spotify, so many different ways for you to get in touch with us. And we're just really happy to have you with us no matter how you approach the show and how you get with us. Just really, really, really glad to have you with us today. And a big thanks to our friends at Merriweather and Tharp for making it all possible. You know, Merriweather and Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. And I realize that's a scary word to use. It's a word that for some of you conjures up some sadness. And listen, I don't say the word lightly. I really don't, because around here we take the job pretty seriously to be the thing that's fun for you and the thing that takes you away from the more serious things that are going on in life. And yet I also know this, that in the lives of all of the folks in our audience, the people who are just trying to make the most of their one life they get a chance to live, serious things come your way. Things you didn't plan for, things you would never have intended for, but it becomes a reality in your life. And obviously, confronting reality is really, really important. For some of you, the reality you're confronting does include a divorce. You're either going through it now, you believe you will be going for it in the future, or maybe some of you are kind of on the other side of that story here right now, but divorce is a reality for an audience the size of ours, at least for a statistical significant portion of you. You're likely going to be facing that at some point in time. So here's what I can tell you. The best decision you can make if you find yourself about to go through this is to hire my friends at Merriweather and Tharp. You say, well, I don't know enough about them yet. Well, okay, I understand that. So take some time to educate yourself on this by going to their website. It's theatlantadivorceteam.com, theatlantadivorceteam.com. You're going to find tons of free resources, blog posts, podcasts, things like that. Because when it comes to the law and how the law can be leveraged to your benefit from the divorce situation, some of this is probably intuitive. Some of this probably just sort of makes sense. Other parts of this might not quite be what you expected they would be. The law sometimes is sort of complicated. That's why you need lawyers, because the law can be complicated. But Merriweather and Tharp is really good at explaining what can be sort of a complicated thing, complicated process in a way that makes sense. Every time I've ever had lunch with Bob Tharp or something like that, one of the partners there, he's always kind of shared some insight with me that I've always thought was really fascinating. And I think the same thing can be true when you have one of those initial consultations with one of those Merriweather and Tharp attorneys. So find them online, theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's theatlantadivorceteam.com. It's Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Contact them today if you think that you're in the midst of this season of life, about to go through this issue. If you look like you might be facing a divorce, you want to know my friends at Merriweather and Tharp, theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's the website. Your source for Georgia divorce is Merriweather and Tharp. All right, so let's get back into the conversation here as we go around the doghouse. Now, we're going to talk to Terence Edwards here in a moment. Looking forward to doing that. But I want to kind of keep the conversation going that we were just a part of a moment ago as we transition here to Around the Doghouse, presented today by our friends at ServPro. And let me kind of set the next phase up of this by saying this. When Kirby Smart was first hired as Georgia coach, there was a debate that took place among some Georgia fans. And I think this is a very fair question. Kirby being an alumnus of Georgia, did it help him be a better coach at UGA? It clearly made him a better figure to present at the press conference. You've heard it said before that athletic directors want to kind of win the press conference with their coaching hire. When you've got a guy like Kirby who is as deeply entrenched at UGA as he was, it was pretty easy for Kirby and for Georgia to quote-unquote win the press conference when he was hired because he just knew the backstory of Georgia so well. It's pretty easy for him to do that. But the question that some folks ask, and maybe this was a cynical question, but it's still, I think, a fair question is, yeah, but beyond the press conference, is it worth anything to Georgia that Kirby played for this program, that graduated from the school, that his wife is an alumna of this school? Is that worth anything to his chance for success at UGA, given the fact that he has deep Georgia roots? And some people may have said yes, some people may have said no. But let me see if I can give you a specific, tangible example of how Kirby being a UGA guy really helps him be the Georgia coach. And it relates to what we were just talking about before. How do you look ahead to get ready for big future games without looking past Florida? And Kirby was asked that yesterday, or asked it on Tuesday night. And I thought he gave an outstanding answer. It's not very long. It's pretty simple. But for a Georgia guy coaching the Georgia team, this is sort of all that really needs to be said, and I think you have to understand UGA to project this in a way that's as matter-of-fact and obviously self-evidently true as the way that Kirby Smart said it. So Kirby was asked on Tuesday night, you're talking about future opponents, you're talking about, thinking about the future. Well, how do you stay locked in on what's happening now? And Kirby gave, I thought, a great answer. Here's Kirby.
Yeah, this is Georgia-Florida matchup. I don't think you have to worry about that. I mean, I might understand if it was a non-conference or an FCS, but that's not going to be the case on Georgia, Florida.
Don't you just love it? I love every word of it. It doesn't need to be a longer answer than that. This is Georgia, Florida. And by the way, I think that clip would work well for like the CBS, intro on the game. I just think that really works well as kind of a pull quote, kind of a, hype building quote. It's Georgia, Florida. No one's looking past Georgia, Florida. Now, if your coach is from Massachusetts, or if your coach is from, Utah, if your coach is from someplace like that, then, hey, maybe he doesn't fully understand what Georgia, Florida is. But you better believe Kirby Smart does, even though, Kirby from time to time in his press conference sort of try to pretend like, no game is any bigger than the other. He'll say, well, Georgia's got a lot of rivalries. And he doesn't like to play along with that from time to time. What you just got right there, though, is a little bit more of an authentic expression of what Kirby Smart really believes. Of course the Georgia-Florida game is a big game. And it doesn't have to be top 5 matchup, the way that Georgia-Tennessee is likely going to be, for it to be a big game. The other team, the fact that they're lousy and stinking, that's what makes it a big game. It's Georgia-Florida. And while Kirby Smart, is talking in a press conference in that sort of sophisticated, very calm and measured way, the truth is we've got evidence from just a year ago that when it's private behind closed doors, when he doesn't think we're all listening, he has a very different way of talking about Florida. So if you're worried about being fired up for the Gators, let's not forget, this was just a year ago.
You make them never want to play again. You just laugh and point at the scoreboard. Physically, I want to break them.
You think that guy's going to look past Florida? He said a year ago, physically, I want to break this team. I want to laugh and point at the scoreboard about how bad we're beating them. You think that guy's going to look past Florida? You think that guy's going to not have his attention on the Gators? You think he's going to do that? Of course that's not the case. And as I said, successful people are always planning for the future. You don't have to be looking past Florida to be looking ahead of Florida. It's sort of the difference between important and urgent. Some of you heard that before. It may seem like it's urgent to get ready for Florida, and to a degree it is, but it's important to get ready for what comes up after that. And Georgia's going to be able to do both of those things. This is why the coaches get paid as much money as they get paid, because you have to be able to process a lot of information at one time to be a successful coach. Georgia's proven capable of doing that before. Kirby Smart's proven capable of doing that before. And maybe the preparation about the Tennessee game is more about what's going on in your head, between your ears. Maybe the Florida game's more about what's happening in your heart, the emotion that you feel to be as fired up for that game as Kirby Smart was at halftime a year ago. But Georgia's kind of showing you they have the ability to do both. Be emotional and fired up when they need to be measured and calm and, approaching from sort of a more cognitive way when they need to be there as well. Georgia's kind of shown you the ability to do both and get ready for a lot of things maybe kind of at once. And that may be, indeed, what is on the horizon here for the Dogs as you head towards not just next Saturday in Jacksonville, but everything else that comes up after that there as well. That is Around the Doghouse, and it's presented today by our friends at Serve Pro. And, of course, we're happy to have them doing what they do for us because, let's face it, when it comes to fire damage, water damage. We've had some of that here with ourselves at Dog Nation. Many of you have kind of seen this before there too. I hear horror stories sometimes where, you know, somebody's home just destroyed, right? Or maybe it's not fully destroyed. Maybe just a portion of it kind of gets, damaged by a kitchen fire, something along those lines. And that can be one of the most harrowing experiences you can ever have. And yet the restoration specialists of ServPro, that's what they live for. That's what they do. They're doing that for whether it be people's homes or your commercial building, your business, wherever it may be located. When significant damage takes place, the restoration specialists at ServPro step in to kind of clean it up, fix it up, and get it back together like it never even happened. That is what ServPro is all about. Also, all the franchises are independently owned and operated. That means when you do business with ServPro, you're doing business with someone who has just as much of a stake in the outcome as you do. That's why that matters. So check out this website. It's servpro.com. Now, serve is spelled S-E-R-V. It's servpro.com. Once again, S-E-R-V, servpro.com. If you've got water damage, if you've got fire damage, if you see a building that you depend on for your livelihood or the place that you live, if you've seen it damaged, then our friends at ServPro are the name you want to remember and reach out to because they can get it all cleaned up, put back together for you like it never even happened. ServPro.com for a lot more on that. All right, before we're done today, it's kind of an important day here around Dog Nation as we remember back on the life of Charlie Trippi, the great former dog who passed away yesterday, and we will do that here today before our show is done. What an unbelievable legacy he leaves behind, and we'll obviously spend some time doing that. But before that, though, a lot to get to when it comes to how Georgia's using its off week, what's coming up next Saturday against Florida, what's coming up beyond that as the Dogs make that push to go for 2 in 22. So let's talk about that and so much more as we welcome in Terence Edwards here on Dog Nation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So Terence Edwards joins us here, Dog Nation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp here today. And Terence, you are a former player. You're a coach now, so you have a lot of insight on this. Georgia gets a little bit of weekend time off, but they're also practicing here right now. Get the rivalry game coming up against Florida. You got major showdowns coming up after that. From your perspective, remembering your own career, kind of how you know football operates right now, what's it like to be a player on this particular week? How much of it's about resting your mind and body? How much of it is about getting ready for the most important games of your season, which are upcoming? How does Georgia use a week like the one that it's in the midst of right now?
All the above. Just depends on which player needs the rest, which players need the reps. I think that's how this week should be. I think most of the time there's a lot of younger guys that would get a lot more reps this week just to continue to get them motivated, continue to stay. Instead of getting scout team reps, they could come down and get some reps, 2s versus 2s, 1 versus 1, but get some reps against those type of guys because they haven't played a game. So it's both, Brent. It's some going to get rest, some going to get reps.
How do you remember yourself being as a player this time of year? I mean, the one thing that we know is that nobody's probably 100%. You've just taken too many shots across the year to feel 100%. But as a player yourself, do you remember, feeling extra tired, but whether it be mentally, physically, whatever else? Like, what's your memory of being a player when you finally got to that Saturday with no game? And how much did you personally feel like you needed your batteries to be recharged once you got to this portion of the schedule?
I think it's bye week comes whenever it comes, but it's the perfect time. And what I mean by that is this is exhausting. I mean, these guys, college football players, been going at it since, the summer. And I don't think a lot of people really truly understand what it takes preparation-wise to become the elite athlete that you need to become. So this is a time, we all circle the bye week because it's so mentally and physically draining. You need to recharge. And, the Bulldogs now got, to me, the biggest rivalry up next. And you can recharge, get refocused, get some of the nicks taken care of, and get ready to go down to Jacksonville and play the Florida Gators.
So, speaking of Florida, one thing I said before you joined us is that I think Kirby Smart's really good at knowing how to, turn on the emotion when he needs to. He gave a great speech at halftime last year that we've all become aware of. Kirby may give a speech like that every week, but that's just one that we happen to hear. But when it comes to the temptation to look past Florida, Georgia may be looking ahead some this week. Kirby's acknowledged that they're getting ready for future opponents. Jake Fromm gave us a little bit of a description about how that might go when it comes to Georgia practice. But for a guy like Kirby, who secretly we know hates Florida the way that all Georgia grads do, that when you have that passion for that game, I have said I don't think there's any way that Georgia looks past Florida. You can look ahead without looking past, and I don't think Georgia looks past Florida. Would you agree with that the emotional level of the rivalry is going to prevent any temptation to kind of look beyond Florida? That I feel pretty confident Georgia's going to be ready for next Saturday. As a guy who kind of understands the nature of all this, do you agree with that?
Oh, most definitely, 100%. And if Georgia comes out flat and doesn't play their best like Missouri, it's not going to be because they're looking ahead. It's definitely not going to be because of that. It's going to be because they just didn't play well. This is the Georgia-Florida. We're not going to look past this team and look to Tennessee. I can't admit that I do know that some of the staffers is probably already breaking down Tennessee because they want to get a jump on it. Tennessee is going to come in hot, but the team, the players are not going to look past Florida and look past Tennessee because you think about it, if we lose against Florida, all the momentum going to that game is going to be lost. So I think that the team, the coaches, everyone understands what this Georgia-Florida rivalry means and what this game means to our future goals as well.
And beyond that, I mean, I think two things are true. One of these may be more true for coaches. One of the things more true for players. To my eyes, one of the things that I often see happening in the Georgia-Florida game, it just seems like there's more jawing in that game than maybe the other games that Georgia plays. Maybe that's because the rivalry means so much to me. Maybe I just sort of feel like I'm noticing more of that when it comes to Georgia-Florida. But it certainly seems like there's an intensity on the field during the game. It's a little bit different than some of the other games. And I think the players probably notice that. That maybe caused them to feed off that. But if you're a Georgia coach, here's the other thing you kind of understand here as well, which is that, hey, right now Billy Napier's trying to build up his program. Right now Billy Napier's trying to establish something at Florida. The longer you can hold him down to prevent that from happening, the longer you can allow Florida to go without establishing any kind of foundation for the next generation of that program, the better it's going to be for you years from now, because it just means that Florida will be that much further behind when you start thinking about future years. So even though it doesn't seem like there's as much motivation in this game as there might be for the other games, the truth is, whether it be for the players in the moment because these Florida guys keep talking trash, or the coaches in the future because they know eventually Florida's going to try to build itself back up again, there actually is still, I believe, a good bit of motivation to go out there and play well against the Gators.
Oh, I think the motivation is the Florida Gators. I don't think there's any other motivation that you need. I understand the rivalry. I went 0-4 against the Gators, and a lot of us that my age did not have a lot of success against Florida. Now we're going back to having success against Florida. I don't think this team is going to look past them. They want to be the team that actually, I think, Terence and that group maybe be 4-1 against them. So I don't think they want to be the senior class that go out with a loss against them games. So I don't think, all this talking, I think more of the talking is coming from the Georgia fan base and the media more than inside that building that they're going to look past this game. And because of the talk about the Georgia Tennessee in a couple weeks. But those players and those coaches are not going to allow any kind of rat poison, Nick Saban would say, to leak in about looking past the Gators and getting ready for Tennessee.
And, of course, we kind of reached the point in the year where, Georgia's played 7 games now, and you're kind of sort of trying to evaluate exactly what Georgia is. I think in one respect this is a team that needs to get a little healthier, and Kirby Smart's going to talk some about that. But we've also seen some really good moments from Georgia here thus far. We've seen some moments in which maybe, hey, Georgia's showing you they kind of still have a little bit to work on. As far as your perspective on this, kind of a big picture standpoint, what do you feel like you've learned about Georgia through 7 games? What do you still want to see more of? What is your overall thought on the Dogs at this point in the season?
My biggest takeaway right now is probably the lack of sacks that we have generated. I think that is going to be a big thing that the defensive staff should try to fix. And I don't know if that's blitzing more. I don't know if that's just coming straight from the D-line with ET stunts, TE stunts that's crossing the end to tackles and tackles to ends. We're going to have to do something to just generate pressure. You do not have to blitz all the time to generate pressure. So I think Nolan Smith and that group going to have to figure out a way to beat one-on-one coverage, or we figure out a way to make it 6-on-6, 5-on-5 on how many they have protection and make it a one-on-one battle. And somebody has to win their one-on-one battle. So my biggest thing is I know I was looking at some numbers that our passing numbers is down from last year defensively, but we don't have as many sacks. That was a weird stat for me. But I just think these next 2 weeks against quarterbacks that's athletic as the two that we're about to face we got to generate pressure from our front four and maybe bring in one or two. So that's my biggest takeaway is just the non-pressure. Well, we have generated pressure. We just haven't generated sacks.
I think that's such a good point. And, Terence, one of the things that kind of rings in my ears here is at the end of the Alabama-Tennessee game, one of the things that Nick Saban said was that he thought his defense played soft down the stretch. Now, part of that to me is just Saban blaming, Pete Golding for the loss as opposed to maybe taking personal responsibility. But nonetheless, that word just doesn't sound good, we played soft defensively. We allowed Tennessee to sort of stand there and pick us apart. And, whether it be Georgia-Tennessee or the college football playoff or maybe Alabama in the SEC championship game, that's the one thing you don't want to see is you want to see Georgia be the aggressor defensively. And I think the point that you're making is such a good one. And I'm not smart enough to know how you dial up that to make sure you get the quarterback to the ground. Kirby Smart's talked about teams just getting rid of the football quicker than they used to, and it makes getting sacks harder. So I'm not smart enough necessarily to tell you what you do about that, but I know you need to do something because I don't think you want to be in the position of having to do what Nick Saban did the other day, which is admit to being soft in a big game situation like that. I think you got to find a way to be aggressive. For all the talent that Georgia's defense had a year ago, Terence, it was really their mindset. I thought they really approached the game very aggressively a year ago. And to me, finding that level of aggression, or at least something close to that, I do think it's a pretty important thing for these Dogs, final 5 games of the regular season, and obviously whatever postseason stuff comes up after that.
Right, most definitely. This is the home stretch. You look at this point of the schedule, this is the meat and potatoes. And you got Florida up, you got Tennessee up, you got Mississippi State up, you got Kentucky up. So this is going to tell a lot about this season. If we could get through this gauntlet, then we will be battle-tested going into that SEC championship game. And whoever presents itself in that game, would still be a big test. It's Alabama, Ole Miss. Ole Miss is still undefeated. I don't think they'll beat Alabama, but they're top of the standings right now. So this is why you come to a SEC school to play these type of opponents week in and week out. This is why so many SEC players are being drafted each year, because you're playing against the best of the best each week. So this is why you come to Georgia. This is why you come to a big-time program to play these games each week. And there's no more cupcakes. There's no more out-of-conference games. This is what SEC football is about, and I'm excited to see how we fare against these teams.
Hey, I want to finish with this. I know this weekend is a big one. I'm looking forward to being a part of the induction ceremony for the Georgia High School Football Hall of Fame. I know you're looking forward to it there as well, as you get enshrined, as your career certainly is worthy and deserving of. I want to say personally congratulations. You and I talked about this when the news first came out, but the induction ceremony here is this weekend. So I just wanted to say how proud I am of you, Terence, and I'll tell you this. You and I have obviously talked for years, and I am very well aware of your college career. I mean, we all are, and I love talking to you about that. But one of the cool things for me about my role, I'm on the board of the Georgia High School Football Hall of Fame, is I really learned a lot about high school careers that I really didn't know that much about. Terence, I knew you were a good player in high school, but I got to be honest with you. I didn't know that you would kind of put up the numbers that you had, and your teammate Takeo Spikes, what you guys did together there at Washington County. And, there are a lot of guys like that. I've mentioned, former Dogs like, Buck Ballou, who obviously I knew for his role in the 1980 national championship team. But honestly, his high school stats were amazing. Way, maybe more prolific than I expect him to be. Andy Johnson, the former quarterback in the Athens area, who obviously went on to great success at UGA. I kind of learned more about him there, too. It's been a fun thing for me to kind of educate myself on just how good some of these careers were, yours included. So congratulations on a well-deserved honor, and I know the entire Washington County family is very proud of you guys going into the Hall of Fame here on that, and I just wanted to say that here before we head to the induction ceremony this weekend about how great it is to be connected to this and seeing your name right there where it belongs among the all-time greats to ever play on Friday nights here in the state of Georgia.
Thank you. If you go look at my numbers in high school, they're very different than what we see today. I didn't throw for 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 yards. That wasn't what we did at Wascana. But what we did at Wascana was we had a community football program where it was Friday Night Lights, where everything shut down, and that's where everyone was on Friday nights in the House of Pain. And my head coach and Rick Tomlin did a great job preparing us for Friday nights and preparing us for college and preparing us for life. One of the most my achievement that I'm very proud of is a team achievement that I was able to help my team win 3 state championships in high school, 2 as a starting quarterback, one my freshman year when Takeo Spikes was a senior. Then my junior and senior year as a starting quarterback, we went back-to-back undefeated years. And if anybody want to go see the best high school game ever in the state championship game, go back and watch 1996 Washington County versus Americus. I'll give you a little short story. We were down 21-0 midway through the third quarter. We were ranked number 1. They're ranked number 2. And my coach just gave me that look. Terence, bring us home. We ended up winning 22-21. And I was the holder on a PAT. It was a bad snap. My center has never snapped a bad snap all year. He rolled it back to me. I ran around the left side, and I scored the 22 to make it 22-21. And I preach this to all my kids where we did that fire drill every day. And I tell my kids all the time, you never know when opportunity is going to meet preparation. I tell my kids that all the time. I never knew when that one play that my coach preached, at some point, is this play is going to win us a game. It won us a state championship for that play. One single play that never happened in my life again, but it won us a state championship. So I think my coach had us prepared, had us ready, and I had great teammates. So 3 state championships, only losing 4 games in my high school career.
Terence, what a great story and what an awesome legacy that you and your teammates were a part of there. Thanks for sharing that with us. Certainly appreciate that. Look forward to seeing you there this weekend for all of that there too. And, of course, back soon for our DawgNation postgame show. We'll take a week off on that and come back and do that the following Saturday. But great stuff, as always. And, Terence, we'll look forward to getting a chance to talk to you soon.
Thank you. See you on Saturday.
Yes, sir.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, so many great careers, and I tell you, it's one of the things that gets me excited about it. And, listen, I'm one of those guys, I'm not smart enough to be a historian, but I do like history, if you know the difference. And so, given the task of, voting for these guys to go into the Hall of Fame for the first time and learning something about that, it really is really amazing. I'm going to give you another quick example of this. So this past week, Jaden Gibson, the receiver from Rabun County, just set the all-time career record for receiving yards in Georgia high school football. And the record that he broke belonged to Stan Rome, who played at Valdosta. Rome is obviously going into the High School Football Hall of Fame this weekend too. But this is like, decades ago that the career receiving yards mark was set, and yet was just broken here this past week. So we're in an age now in which you got Georgia high school quarterbacks completing 70% of their passes. You got teams scoring, in some cases, we got one team in the state at least, Hughes scoring more than 50 points per game this year. You've got a number that are scoring, more than 40 points per game this year. Big high-scoring games in Georgia high school football are happening with regularity just the same way they are in college now. And yet with all of that, the all-time receiving mark in Georgia for a career was still set like decades ago until just this past week. Obviously, Stan Rome, the father of J. Rome, who Georgia fans will remember. But it just gives you an idea to appreciate, how great some of the all-time greats, including some of the all-time greats, which took a little bit older for me to be able to remember. But that's what the Hall of Fame is sort of about. It's supposed to be about a historic recognition, and we'll get a chance to do that here this weekend with the inaugural class. Really, really excited about that taking place at the College Football Hall of Fame. Is going to be the site for the induction ceremony, and then obviously the Georgia High School Football Hall of Fame will kind of live on for years after that. But the first class coming up this weekend, really excited. Speaking of being really excited, we're also really excited to go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I continue to hear from a lot of you all who are planning on being on board the second ever Dog Nation cruise coming up this April. And if you want to find out more about that, royaldogs.com is a website you can go to. royaldogs.com. Here's the thing you got to understand is that the Independence of the Seas, the ship that we're going to be on, we're leaving April 24th, going to Nassau in the Bahamas, Perfect Day, Coco Cay. The ship that we're going to be on already has a lot of fun things going on. There's great stuff to do in Nassau. Perfect Day, Coco Cay really is, I believe, a perfect day. It's probably the single best place you can ever spend a day. I would say pretty close for me. I can't imagine anything I would enjoy more than a private island, the Bahamas like that. Just sort of sounds good already. Get the thrill side with the water park, get the chill side with the largest freshwater pool in the Bahamas, all kinds of food and drink going on. Just a great, great day. And obviously on board the ship, you got the entertainment, Broadway-style shows, you got the Flow Rider. You got so many cool entertainment things to do. But what makes a Dog Nation cruise so much special, so special is, in addition to that, you've got special Dog Nation events taking place. We're going to have a huge NFL draft party. The final night of the cruise, the NFL draft. So we'll have a huge draft party going on. Last year, that was an amazing experience. We're going to have, some special kind of cocktail party get-togethers and some fun and games and all kinds of things like that. So in addition to all the great stuff that already takes place on a Royal Caribbean cruise, you've got some special Dog Nation cruise special events going on too. So Royal Caribbean has given us a name, a travel agent specially selected for us to help book this cruise and take care of all of Dog Nation's cruise travel needs. Her name is Jessica Slater. I've gotten to know Jessica really well. We're good friends, and I think you'll really like her too. So give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. She can get you booked up on this Dog Nation cruise or any other Royal Caribbean cruise you want to take. Jessica's got you covered on all of that. So make sure you get in contact with her today. All right. Now, let's talk about something serious. So yesterday, a lot of you wanted me to address what appeared to be video of Jermaine Burton punching. There's a couple different videos of him punching two different people. One of those a woman after the end of the Alabama-Tennessee game. The honest truth is that yesterday I was a little bit I don't want to say afraid. That's the wrong word. I was cautious not to speak about the video until I knew for sure it was going to be confirmed. Well, it has been confirmed now. This has been acknowledged to be Burton, and I'll show you yesterday what I did not want to play for you until we knew exactly what it was. It's been shared on Twitter now and TikTok and everything else of Burton kind of walking past the crowd of celebrants, and he's seen kind of lifting his hand in this particular video, kind of striking a woman here in this particular case. And I'm going to tell you what you already know. This isn't good, and especially considering the fact that that's not the only instance, apparently, in which Burton is alleged to have done that. Now, what I think is actually even more of a potential concern here is Nick Saban's response to this. You've heard it said that Saban's going to treat this like they do all discipline issues internally. But then beyond that, I want to read you this quote from Saban, who says that it's a difficult situation. It's a difficult situation for the league. It's a difficult situation for all of us that are in this situation. He says, we certainly don't condone any mistreatment of anybody, whether they should or shouldn't be there. He means on the field. I think you've got to have respect for other people, but at the same time, it's a difficult situation for all of us. This is not a good quote from Saban. And to me, it's another example of, I don't know, something just feels a little bit weird and different about Alabama right now. And this, what I believe, kind of mishandling of this situation publicly, I think puts Alabama in a little bit of jeopardy. I don't think you ever want to have a quote attributed to you where you say, I think you've got to have respect for other people, but, like, there is no but on the other end of that sentence, right? I think you've got to have respect for people, full stop. There is no, like, equivocation for why it's okay not to have respect for someone. And some people are going to come back and say, well, she was on the field. She's not supposed to be there. Y'all, that may sound good in a social media conversation, but that argument doesn't hold itself up in court. It just doesn't. And anybody who has any experience with that's going to, help explain, why that's true. That may sort of sound like logic in some sort of social media debate, but that's not the kind of thing that becomes a legal defense in this particular case. And I got to tell you, when Nick Saban kind of behaves casually about this, I do think that it opens the door for, if you're some, I don't know. I just think it potentially makes what is already a pretty volatile situation potentially even more volatile. And I'm not telling you that Burton should never play again or anything like that. Frankly, I don't know what the appropriate punishment here is on this. But I think if you're Nick Saban, you got to be really, really careful being too casual about this. And I think with this particular quote, essentially shrugging it off, saying it's handled internally, and shrugging it all off to say, basically blaming the people for being on the field for why, Jermaine Burton struck them. I don't think that works based on the video that we have here. Burton wasn't defending himself. Burton, wasn't, responding to some sort of threat to him. He just appeared to be lashing out in frustration and, basically disregarding this as the fans were not where they weren't supposed to be. I'm just telling you right now, that's definitely not a legal defense, nor do I believe that's much of a defense in the court of public opinion either. We saw this other day with, was the Raiders player that kind of had, a similar incident, that these kinds of things are at times treated pretty seriously. I think that what Burton has done here is probably more serious than Nick Saban is acknowledging with his public remarks there. So I think there are a lot of reasons to question the culture currently at Alabama. And we said, hey, there is no free lunch in life. There is no such thing as only upside, no downside. When you bring in a bunch of players from all over the galaxy and put them on the same team together who have no cohesion with each other, no connection to each other, you may not necessarily have much of a team culture with all of that. And maybe that's some of what Alabama's here dealing with right now. This is clearly a headache, and it is clearly a messy situation. I'm not quite so sure that Saban did anything to make it better. If anything, he may have made it worse. Moving on to, happier subject matter, a little bit more in keeping with our normal show content. I think this weekend provides a really interesting measuring stick opportunity for would-be playoff contenders. And let me kind of walk through the story of the season here for a moment. Georgia beat Oregon 49-3 to begin the year. And there was a lot of hype that came Georgia's way after that. Georgia quickly moved back up to number one. It didn't start the year at number one, but it moved to number one very quickly after that. And for some Georgia fans at the time, that was like too much hype. Georgia's getting praised too much, and it made some Georgia fans nervous. And what I told you was, and you'll remember this if you're a regular listener to our program, what I said is that right now, if you want to go back to that point in the year, at that point, Georgia was the only national team that had really asserted itself at all. Alabama barely beat Texas. They didn't get much attention. Ohio State barely beat Notre Dame. They didn't get much attention. So Georgia was kind of the only team getting any hype because they were the only team that had really any kind of win of significance. We sort of fast forward a few weeks, used last week as an example of this. Michigan got a big win. They dominated Penn State. That's a validation of where kind of Michigan is at this point in the year, and I think you have to put them in the national contender category. They were undefeated. They played a soft schedule. Last week was the first opponent that mattered, and Michigan passed that test with flying colors. Tennessee, more so than I certainly expect them to be, announced their inclusion into the national contender discussion by the way in which they beat Alabama. And all of a sudden now you think about Tennessee, it's like a top four team, and they're a playoff contender. They are now a part of the national discussion. Well, this upcoming week on Saturday, I think provides another opportunity, especially given the fact that there aren't really a lot of, like last week, there were so many big games, you couldn't pay attention to all of them as closely as you wanted to. This week, for the big teams playing in games, they're going to get a little bit more attention than they otherwise might normally would, and it will be an opportunity to sort of see what some of these teams are all about. So let's kind of go through this here just really quickly for a moment. Clemson hosts Syracuse. Now, Clemson's like a 2-touchdown favorite, but Syracuse undefeated. They're ranked, 14th right now. This is a chance for Clemson to show one of two things. Either they're undefeated because they play in the ACC, or they're undefeated because they're actually good. And, they've kind of made it through what kind of counts in the ACC as a tough stretch. NC State and Wake Forest and Florida State. Clemson's kind of been through that stretch of their schedule, and now it's Syracuse here on Saturday. That if Clemson comes out and dominates here at home, then I do think you have to probably treat them somewhat seriously as a legitimate playoff contender. But right now, I think I'm left to still kind of wonder, how good is Clemson really? DJ Uiagalelei is certainly in better shape this time now than he was a year ago, but I'm not quite so sure this Clemson defense, although still formidable, is as good as it was last season. I don't quite know how good Clemson is. They may be very good. They may be less than that. I do think the Syracuse game for them on Saturday is a little bit of a showcase opportunity to say, alongside of Tennessee and alongside of Michigan, teams who've introduced themselves into the national discussion, that Clemson belongs to be there right now too. But if Clemson's only barely beating Syracuse, or if in some crazy way they were to lose, then at that point, I'm probably not that interested in talking about Clemson, much right now. I'd say a little bit of that's probably true for Iowa, too, Ohio State hosting Iowa on Saturday. They're a huge favorite in the game, but Iowa is good defensively. And, for Ohio State here thus far, this is kind of what sort of counts as a big game. They haven't really played a ton of big games as of yet. Notre Dame's terrible. Iowa's not very good either, but it is a chance for Ohio State to show you a little bit more. Now, they're going to show a lot more when they go to Penn State next Saturday, but it's a little bit of a showcase for an Ohio State team that's mostly winning its games easily while not really playing anybody of note. This is, I would believe, the best defense they've played by far so far this season, so it's a little bit of an example for Ohio State to demonstrate something. And then if you want to kind of get beyond that, I'll give you two more games kind of way outside our region here for a moment. TCU has been in a crazy stretch where they've played a lot of ranked teams in a row, and they've looked good doing so. They host Kansas State there on Saturday. Look, TCU's not going to win the national championship. They're not going to make the college football playoff. But if they go through another one of these wins and they're still kind of doing what they're doing, you at least have to give them a little bit of credit for that. And I'll say the same thing for the UCLA-Oregon game there, too. UCLA is way better than almost anybody thought they would be. They beat Oregon. Now they go on the road to, they beat Utah. Now they go on the road to Oregon. I sort of don't really know what to expect from this game, but if UCLA were to win, I think you'd have to take them pretty seriously there, too. So if you're thinking about, okay, what's happening in college football right now with my team, the Georgia Bulldogs, off? You do have teams like TCU and UCLA trying to show they're for real, and then teams that are a little higher up the food chain, such as Ohio State and Clemson, that really have a chance to demonstrate something on Saturday, that we're getting closer to those first playoff rankings coming out. But more importantly than that, we're getting closer to having an idea of what the short list of true playoff contenders really is. And by the way, I guess you'll put Ole Miss going to LSU as an example of this too. Slight underdog there in Baton Rouge, chance for the Rebels to prove something. As of now, they're still undefeated, and they're actually ranked ahead of Alabama in the SEC West, so let's include them in this discussion, at least for right now there as well. That the list of actual legitimate playoff contenders could be on its way to being whittled down some, or maybe in some cases, resumes substantiated a bit more. So something to think about there, and we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And here on DawgNation Daily, want to focus here for a moment on the passing of Charlie Trippi. And listen, I said this on Twitter yesterday. Like, I am decades too young to have known Trippi as a player. And yet I still have a lot of nostalgia for Trippi from the standpoint that my dad's dad told me a lot about him. My dad told me the stories that his dad had told him. My mom's dad, who was a big sports fan, kind of, told those same things there as well. And like, that's my nostalgia when it comes to Trippi. And listen, if you're a younger person than me, your dad very well might not be old enough to have a dad who knew anything about Charlie Trippi, because we're talking about a player whose, final year at Georgia came in 1946. That's a long time ago now. So I hope you will read the story at DawgNation.com, or read, just about the Trippi legacy of his service to our country and his, Pro Football Hall of Fame career. I think of him as a dog, but, he went on to be the number 1 overall draft pick of the Chicago Cardinals and went on to a Pro Football Hall of Fame career, and obviously played the game in a very different time than it's played now. And just living to be 100 years old is in itself an amazing accomplishment. And it's just a great story. It's an unbelievable legacy. And, I'm lucky. I've had a couple different chances to meet him over the years, many of you, because he was in the Athens area and he would make public appearances and things like that, especially, 10, 15 years ago, would make a lot more public appearances, do interviews and things like that, be available for autograph signings. You've had a chance to really brush elbows with greatness, which is a really cool thing. And I'll also say this just really quickly. Now, this is kind of an odd, maybe way to kind of take this story, but I spent some time today looking at like the 1946 Heisman race, because Trippi actually finished runner-up in that year's Heisman race to Glenn Davis. Now, Glenn Davis was kind of one of these sort of all-time great type guys, too. If you've ever heard like Mr. Inside, Mr. Outside from Army at the time, West Point was power. Glenn Davis was, a guy that almost won the Heisman Trophy 2 years before that, finally won it in 1946. And I was thinking, if you look at Trippi's numbers in comparison to Glenn Davis, he actually had better numbers. And the meme where like the woman and the man are sort of like laying back to back in bed, and the woman saying, I bet he's thinking about other women, and the man's like thinking about some crazy thing. Well, this is kind of like my life this morning, where if my wife knew how much time I was spending like breaking down like the 1946 Heisman race, but I was really thinking about that. It's like, for a guy like Trippy, you can make a case that, he really should have won the award. Like, he had better numbers than Davis. He went on to a better pro career. Some of that for Davis was obviously impacted because he got injured, and Davis was like a really big, like kind of a celebrity type figure. He would go on to date Elizabeth Taylor at a time, and that was a very big deal in the early 1950s. So Davis was kind of a celebrity, and that probably aided him in winning the award. But this is what I was thinking about. This is a very odd thing to think, but I was thinking about this. Like, can you imagine if there was a DawgNation Daily in the 1940s? Like, how big of a deal that would be for us, kind of pushing Trippy to win the award in a time when, like, back then, Atlanta as a city was much smaller. Like, Atlanta didn't really explode in population like the 1960s. Like, southern towns were just smaller, and southern towns weren't really represented in the media as appropriately as they probably should have been. So a southern guy like Trippy trying to win the Heisman Trophy against this national figure, Glenn Davis from Army, just had no chance of doing that. And I was just sort of thinking, it's a real shame that we didn't have a DawgNation Daily back then to make the case. Yeah, you put it in black and white there. That's a little black and white to kind of think back on that's what DawgNation Daily would have looked like back in 1946. Yeah, maybe that's the case. But, if you had that back then to make that case, maybe Trippy would have won the award. Now, listen, his legacy doesn't need the Heisman Trophy. Obviously, he's a Pro Football Hall of Famer. He's, a retired jersey at Georgia. There's only 4 of those. His legacy stands up on its own without that. But there is a special cachet for that. Hey, you won the Heisman Trophy. Frank Sinkwich is kind of remembered because he was a Heisman Trophy winner. Herschel Walker will be remembered forever because he was a Heisman Trophy winner. And you sort of wish there was a little bit more of a media apparatus down here in this part of the country back then to make what I believe is a deserving case that Trippy, who was the runner-up, should have won it in 1946. And I guess in a roundabout way, and I'll wrap this up, I see the same thing in other sports there too. It's like the more I look on the career of, like, say, Dale Murphy, the Atlanta Braves, he ought to be in the Hall of Fame. I think more people now are kind of coming to that same conclusion. And yet, maybe when you had the chance to really make that argument, maybe the argument wasn't made as aggressively as it should have been back then. Or like a guy like Andrew Jones later on for the Braves. I think you have a strong case to be made that he should be in the Hall of Fame there as well. But once again, maybe in the moment, the argument wasn't made as strongly as it could have been. I guess what I'm saying is this, is that sometimes sort of like Homer media gets a bad knock sometimes. But the truth is if back in the 1940s, if we didn't make the case for Trippy to win the Heisman Trophy, he was going to. Or if you don't make the case for Dale Murphy to make the Hall of Fame, down here in kind of Braves country, well, who's going to? I can promise this, the people in New York aren't going to do it. The people in Boston aren't going to do it. That sometimes there's a case to be made for making the case for your own, because if you don't, then there's no one left to make the case for them. So the bottom line here is that the Trippy legacy stands up no matter what. I mean, he is not just a great football player. He's a great American, an all-time great, a legacy that we should all, be inspired by. But you can go back and look at that 1946 season, and you can make a pretty good case that maybe he should have been the Heisman Trophy winner. And I only wish there'd been somebody there to make the case for him way back then. Let me also, give a shout out to our friends at the Durham Law Group here there as well. You're hurt on the job, you're injured in an accident, you want to be made right, and our friends at the Durham Law Group give you a chance to do that. And they don't just practice personal injury law, they define it. What that means is there are no fees, no expenses unless you win. They don't benefit unless you benefit, and that's the commitment they're willing to make for you, and they're going to go to work for you and get you what you deserve in a situation like this. So give them a call, 844-4GA-HURT. That's 844-4GA-HURT, or you can also find them online at georgiahurt.com. That website, once again, georgiahurt.com. All right, we got a bunch of golden shoes to give out today. I want to give out a few of these. Let me start. We talk about our Dog Nation cruise. One of the great dog fans on our Dog Nation cruise was our buddy James Lawson, commenter to our shows sometimes, and he reached out to me on Twitter yesterday after the passing of Trippy to kind of talk about his own personal experience here. And I share this because so many people have told similar stories here in the last little bit, that his wife Jenny worked at the bookstore her senior year and was assigned to kind of be with Trippy for his autograph table when he was there with his wife. This is going back years ago. She says, my wife got to know them, told them about our upcoming wedding, and then a year later we went back to see them, and the two of them actually remembered her. He was a DGD. And that's kind of the cool thing. When you're like the sort of like the legend status, and for decades, that's what Trippy was, A lot of people want your time. A lot of people want, kind of have that moment with you. And Trippy was always really good at making those folks feel welcomed. And obviously he leaves behind a great legacy, and we remember him quite fondly here today. Also, golden shoe going out to some folks who continue to kind of make fun of the current state of the Alabama situation. Robert shared this with me on Twitter. Roll, tears, roll. Yeah, it feels like you're getting a lot of that here right now. And Robert will laugh at Alabama a little bit on that. And also one more to give out to you here today there as well. Georgia on Tap, thanks for sharing this. Getting ready for the lousy, stinking Gators on the football field coming up 2 Saturdays from now. But Georgia on Tap sharing with us that Georgia also got the sweep against Florida in volleyball there as well, knocking off number 11 Florida. Dogs running their record now to 13-5, 4-3 in conference. And that's great to see. Anytime you beat the lousy, stinking Gators, that's always something to celebrate. And I appreciate Georgia on Tap sharing that with us here today. So we'll give a golden shoe to him and to the UGA volleyball team for getting that big win. Fun to consider. By the way, speaking of lousy, stinking Gators, long national title drought now stretches 5,033 days. That's a lot of sadness in Gator country, and we don't mind that at all. In fact, we're ready to deal some more out. 9 days from right now, we've now reached single digits in our Gator Hater Countdown. Boy, that's cool to think about. And we will see you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that today. So, yeah, we are fondly remembering the legacy of Charlie Trippy, who, I mean, you go to a Wikipedia page like this, and it's like this long, and you just know you lived a great life, and Mr. Trippy certainly did. And it's just it's an amazing legacy, an amazing legacy. So let me just say this. We have done a pretty good job this week of taking a lot of comments. Y'all, I can't take that many today. We've just got 8 million things going on. So apologies in advance for that, but we want to obviously make good use of your time here for a little bit. So we'll take some comments, and we'll kind of bounce on out of here after that. And hope all of you are doing really, really well. And hope you're getting ready for a fun weekend with no football on Saturday. Hope you're getting ready for that. Or maybe some college football that doesn't belong to Georgia. Let's see what else. Yeah, Zelo Allen and Nick Roundtree kind of debating the there you go, a great look at Charlie Trippy. Nick Roundtree and Zelo Allen kind of debating the legalese around the Burton thing. Like, I'm just telling you, what wins a social media conversation doesn't hold an ounce of weight in a court of law. It just doesn't. And I'm not a lawyer. I just know that that's what lawyers say, that the law is the law, and the law does not make any kind of account for, well, the fans ran on the field even though they're not supposed to. That does not give you, free reign to just go slugging people. That's, what it doesn't. And like, my issue here is more about the Saban part of this than the Burton part of this. And part of the reason I want to talk about this yesterday is because, we've all seen examples where, hey, sometimes video can be a distortion of what happened. Sometimes what looks to be true. So we oftentimes find out, well, the video made it seem this way, but it was actually this way, or whatever else. That like, our eyes can lie to us sometimes in very, very short videos. But it's been confirmed basically by Alabama that the video is kind of, what it was. And that's not a good situation. It's not a good situation. I don't know what comes of it, but it's not a good situation. Eric Ray asked about the A.D. Mitchell injury. So one point in time was the ankle. Kirby Smart has mentioned the thumb, and Smart has said the thumb has kind of bothered him more than the ankle, and maybe that's true, but I think a lot of us who saw Mitchell running during the Auburn game, at least to me, I sort of felt like he wasn't quite running the way that I'd kind of been used to seeing him run. Only played a couple snaps there that day. So Kirby has talked about the thumb being a pretty big issue as it relates to Mitchell. But to my eyes, it just didn't seem like he was really running 100% with the snaps that he got in the Auburn game. BJY says, fun weekend with no football. That's not a real thing. Fair enough, BJ. You're right about that. Maybe trying to find a way to make it as fun as you can with no dogs is maybe what I meant to say there. Jason Alex says, who do you have between UCLA and Oregon? I think Oregon at home. I think probably Oregon at home for me, too, on that. We're going to make that pick officially for our Go With The Flow on Friday night on the DawgNation video channels. I think my early lean on that is probably towards Oregon. We really haven't seen UCLA play a road game of note yet. Now, they don't really play much of a home field advantage when they play the Rose Bowl, as you're probably aware of. They're very sparse crowds. But, Oregon fans are going to be fired up to face their old coach. And, Oregon's just kind of fired up because they're back in the top 10 again. They've kind of shaken off the 49-3 loss, and they're playing pretty good football right now. So I'm guessing this is a pretty raucous environment, and I'm guessing for a UCLA team that hasn't really faced that yet this year, that could be a little bit of an issue. Greg Childers says, this is an interesting question. He says, don't you think it'd be a bad look if Tennessee did win the SEC after their 18 level 1 violations with literally no punishment? So, Greg, it sounds like then Georgia's got a responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. If that's a bad look for the league, then maybe Georgia will be on the side of the Angels here and prevent that from taking place. Matt Rugavino also kind of reminding that Tennessee really hasn't played much of a true road game yet either, and that's really pretty true there as well. Let's go over to YouTube and get some comments over there. Let's see what else. Jack Marino on the subject, kind of what happened. Yeah, I mean, there's a reason that we didn't talk about the video yesterday. Sometimes grainy video shot from a long way away. I mean, there's just lots of examples where the internet goes crazy about a video and you find out, well, no, the video wasn't actually what you thought it was. I mean, they're just examples of that. But when Saban confirmed it yesterday, well, at that point in time, you sort of feel like you sort of have to talk about it. And I'll be really honest with you here. One of the things that we do is we love kind of going after the coaches. We make fun of the rival coaches, Dan Mullen or Nick Saban or all this kind of stuff. But if you'll notice, we don't really do much as it relates to players. We don't really kind of go after the rival players. We don't certainly go after the Georgia players. We're a little bit kinder around here to players than we are to coaches. I don't know. That just kind of always seemed more appropriate to sort of make fun of someone who's older than me, more powerful than me, the average player, especially kind of pre-NIL, kind of a little bit smaller platform, a little bit whatever. We just don't really pick on players too much. We never really have. Some people wish we would, but we just never really have. I've always kind of felt like that's a little bit distasteful. Making fun of coaches, it's if I always want to punch up, not punch down. That's just always been kind of my rule. It's I'll go after someone who has, more power than me, like a coach, but I don't really want to go after someone like a player, whether it be a Georgia player or anybody else, because in most cases, those are people with smaller platform, just smaller everything, younger everything else too. We like to punch up. We don't like to punch down. And so when it comes to the Burton thing, I'm way more interested in talking about Nick Saban's response to it than I'm what Burton did. Burton did it. He shouldn't have done it. But it's beyond that, I'm just not going to say much about it one way or another. And some of you, it is actually really interesting to me just how much energy there is around this topic, because there are a lot of Georgia fans who are obviously really, really bothered by the fact that Burton left and went to Alabama. And so when you see something like this happen, that kind of re-galvanizes that original discussion. I do get that. But for whatever reason, my energy is more centered around what is Nick Saban saying about this more so than what Burton did. The video appears to show Burton striking a person. Full stop. Actually, I guess it shows him striking a couple of people. Full stop. That was the wrong thing to do. He shouldn't have done it, and it's not a great situation for him. But I'm just a lot more interested in talking about Nick Saban's response to it, because Saban's the one here that I believe has all the power. Let's see what else. G. Grace Bama Boy says, I'm sure he'll get suspended a game or two. I'm guessing that's probably what's forthcoming here. I am. DMart42 asking about Terence Edwards having any thoughts on Jermaine Burton. So here's my thought process on that. I am not going to put Terence on today's show in a position of having to be a spokesman for Burton when Terence wasn't there when it happened, right? If Alabama wants to be a spokesman for Burton, they have every right to be. If Burton wants to speak up on his own behalf, he has every right to be. I don't think it's fair in this particular case to have Terence be a spokesman for Burton. And listen, there's a very good chance that Terence will weigh in on this on social media. There's a very good chance that oftentimes Terence kind of pops in our comment sections, kind of weighs in there. If Terence wants to be a spokesman for Jermaine, he's got all kinds of platforms he can use to do that. But in this particular case, I don't think that's necessarily fair to have to ask him to speak up on Burton's behalf here one way or another. I think, the video speaks for itself. It's clearly something that Burton shouldn't have done. I think Alabama's the one with responsibility here to kind of see how that's going to be handled. And in this particular case, a family friend, a mentor, to say it's Terence's responsibility to speak out on that, I don't necessarily think that's the case. Terence didn't ask me not to bring it up, but it's one of those things where, putting Edwards in the position of being a spokesman, I just don't think is something that is necessarily appropriate in that situation. Jonathan Aaron says, are you going to fanboy out this weekend meeting Ron Simmons? Jonathan, I actually probably am, because we had a meeting last week that, yeah, indeed, Ron Simmons is going to be there, and really excited about that. Simmons will be on hand for the big event, and so I am very excited about that. That's another one of those guys. It's like when I was a kid and you watch wrestling, you sort of assume that everything they said about every wrestler was exaggerated. And so when like Tony Schiavone and Jim Ross were always talking about Ron Simmons being a great football player at Florida State, I always thought that was probably just an exaggeration, because there were a lot of guys they said were great football players. If you go back and look, you find out, no, they weren't. I'm not even sure this guy actually even played. Like, there was a lot of exaggeration that went on. Like, anybody who had any kind of like athletic career, they sort of made it sound bigger than it was. The Rock's an example of that, obviously at Miami. But Ron Simmons was good. Like, Ron Simmons, and like, I'm a little too young to remember him at Florida State. Certainly don't remember his high school career at Warner Robins, but he was good. And so that's another thing that's kind of cool about this. I just think that, and listen, I'm kind of a geek, so I guess I like this kind of stuff more than some people do, but I love learning about some of this stuff that I did not know. And everything that those wrestling commentators used to say about Ron Simmons as a football player, it really was the case. He was a outstanding player. Went on to a great wrestling career and kind of a trailblazer in many ways in the squared circle, but a really terrific football player too. Yeah, multi-time All-American, unbelievable. JJ also saying that Ron Simmons had an awesome career. He really did. Really did. Beer Cans and Baddies asking about Saban handling the Burton situation of the SEC commissioner. Yeah, so like, here's the thing that's a little bit complicated about all of this, is that there's still a lot of emotion related to this Alabama-Tennessee game. And I think the more that, like, you just want to be really careful about, because all of a sudden a lot of people can sort of step up and say, well, it's my job to handle it. Nick Saban's not going to handle it. I'm going to handle it. And that just creates a lot of stuff, right? And so that's why, Saban standing up, speaking forcefully, I think would have helped here. And listen, maybe behind closed doors it all gets settled and it's all fine and it's all kind of done. But that's kind of the case there on all of that. So, yeah. Jack Marino also on the subject of Bill Goldberg. Yeah, Goldberg was a good player at Georgia. Goldberg was good enough at Georgia to get to the NFL, had a little bit of a career there too. And I definitely, when Goldberg first came out as a wrestler, I definitely knew right away that's got to play at Georgia. Like, that was, Goldberg was a memorable football player to me far before I ever knew he was going to be a professional wrestler. The first time I saw him walk out, that's Bill Goldberg. Looked a little bit different than he had during his playing career, but I definitely remembered him. Jonathan Aaron says, am I going to get a picture with Ron Simmons and show us? I hope to. I definitely hope to. Let's see what else. Let me go back to DawgNation.com for a minute. Let's see what else is happening down here in this comment section. All right, here we go. Diedrich Frazier and the Alabama culture problem. Culturally, there's a lot about Alabama that does not seem to be working really perfectly right now. I'll admit that. Now, listen, maybe they galvanize and they come together before the season is done, but we said this last year that the one thing that we felt like Georgia had an advantage against Alabama on is a culture. There seemed to be a culture at Georgia where guys seem to be willing to play together. And obviously everybody wants individual glory, but when you build the Alabama program around individual glory and come here, get a bunch of stats, things like that, well, guess what? there's only room for a couple of guys to get a lot of stats. And when you were promised a lot of stats, which Nick Saban publicly promised Jermaine Burton a lot of stats. Nick Saban publicly, essentially promised recruits like Ajay Hall a bunch of stats. Hey, come here. We're the program that gives big stats to wide receivers. Well, guess what? If you're giving big stats to somebody, that means you're taking away opportunities for somebody else. And listen, when Jameson Williams, that works out really well. But when Ajay Hall spends an entire year pouting and not a player that you feel like you could trust in a national championship game, that's the downside of all of that. And, who knows what's kind of going on right now when really nobody in that receiving room seems capable of kind of putting up the prolific numbers that Nick Saban kind of promised to some of these guys. The one Louisville guy, I guess, is maybe trying to work his way back from injury, I guess. But there is a downside to that. There is no free lunch. There is no such thing as anything that's all upside and no downside. And I think that Alabama's kind of finding some of that out right now. JP brings up a red flag about Alabama with Will Anderson and Dallas Turner. I would say that when it comes to Anderson, he was a little bit of a no-show in the Texas game and a little bit of a no-show in the Tennessee game. Now, he may have 17 sacks against Georgia. He very well might. But he has not been big in their biggest games here thus far. Let's see what else. Stafford Square Dog, going back to remember a time when Goldberg was still in college. That's really interesting. Randy Hall on the subject of Chris Peele getting ready to make his commitment announcement on Sunday. I don't have a time for you on that, but we'll have Jeff on Friday. We'll try to find out more about that. Basil also says the flip side, well, if Dallas Turner and Will Anderson aren't getting pass pressure against Tennessee, then is there any hope for Georgia to be able to do that? Which is a fair question because you're going to need to one way or another. All right, final comments. We got to go. On Facebook, again, Johnny Robinson on Nick Saban's scalp. It is, look, that forehead was shining, not even forehead, the top of his head was just shining on Saturday. Now, listen, I can't say too much because, like, at one point in time, I was going to make fun of Dan Mullen because I thought it looked like he had a pretty strong comb-over going on TV during some of his analyst work. And I was like, if I do this, I'm the biggest hypocrite in the world because if I bend my head down right now, top of my head is just available for anybody to see. But, Nick Saban's always been, I'd say that Saban quietly is a little bit more vain than some people realize. That hair gets a fresh coat of paint pretty frequently and combed in just such a way to make sure everybody knows that he's still got, full coverage. But on Saturday, that hair wasn't covering any better than the Alabama secondary was. He just looked like an older guy on the sidelines. He just did. Kyle and Susan Richter also talking about the Jermaine Burton situation. It's definitely a hot topic right now. I've sort of said all I can say on it. Burton shouldn't have done it. I don't think that Saban handled it particularly well. I'm not sure where it goes from here. I just don't have much more on it than that. But it's not good. It's not good. Let's see what else. Nick Roundtree on the subject of connection. You hear that from Kirby Smart all the time. And listen, I'm a big believer in this. And I don't mind telling you this. Like, as a media dude, there are a lot of times when I wish that Kirby Smart would say more interesting stuff than he does just because it'd make my job easier. I'm just being honest with you. That if Kirby Smart would say crazy stuff, we'd have an easy show. We'd just talk about the crazy thing Kirby Smart said. And Kirby Smart doesn't really say that. Kirby Smart says a lot of the same stuff over and over again. And so, as a media person, you're tempted to get a little frustrated by that. Gosh, it'd be nice if Kirby would stop saying the same thing about connection over and over again and start talking about, how about he wants to do whatever. Just make my job easier. But I think you're left to conclude that he really does mean this. It's not just him saying something to prevent him from saying something else that's more interesting. I do believe they genuinely believe that. And I think we've heard examples of this from players. Go back to like last spring, not the most recent spring leading into this season, but the spring prior to that, going into the 2021 season. Those players, I think I remember, I think it was Jake Camarda talked about this some, about how John Fitzpatrick, I believe, also talked about this, about how much they had kind of grown closer together and the work that Georgia had done at the beginning of the calendar year 2021 to make that be the case. I think we'll never fully appreciate how hard 2020 was on a lot of people in a lot of instances. But in college football, it took teams and it pulled them apart. And I'll tell you this. Y'all, as someone who spends a lot of time around high school football in our state, I can tell you very clearly, there are some high school teams in our state that still haven't recovered from COVID. They still have not recovered from it. Their players missed an entire year of being in the weight room. In some cases, players just kind of fell out of school all the way around. I don't think we've fully given the attention to just how much some programs were really damaged by COVID, and it upended their normal routine. And here we are, like sort of 2 years after the 2020, worst of it. And there are some programs that still haven't put all the pieces back together again. And they're trying their best to. They're trying to rebuild their roster. They're trying to rebuild their focus. But it just is an example of how damaging that year was for a lot of schools. And maybe some of you have your own story to tell about that. Well, in college football, you got a lot more resources. You got a lot, more kind of going for you. But on the other side of 2020, I do think there was a need for a program like Georgia to rebuild itself. After you had a year in which, guys couldn't really meet in the same place at the same time, guys weren't really working out together at the same place at the same time. I mean, Jake Fromm in the NFL talked about how, as a quarterback, he was isolated from the rest of his team because he was the quarterback they were going to use in case they, had everybody get COVID, and how weird that was for him, for a social creature, like most quarterbacks are, to have to be kind of in isolation. Like 2020 was a weird year. And so in 2021, Georgia went about the business of kind of rebuilding a team culture. And I believe that played a big role in Georgia winning the national championship. In fact, I know it did because that's why they doubled down on that same kind of connection to begin this year. I truly believe they think that's an important component to winning. It's one of the reasons why, every time I want to see Kirby talk about, say, Brock Bowers, he pivots to talk about Darnell Washington because he doesn't want it to be about just one guy. He wants to be about everybody. And I honestly believe that there are a few guys they ought to feature a little bit more prominently. But Kirby, if he's sitting here, says, hey, I'm worried about the connection this team has, the way in which everybody kind of plays together. And there's no doubt that's kind of working for Georgia for the most part. All right. Now, final comment, and we are gone. Let's see what else. Yeah, so a lot of the Bama conversation continuing here and all that. Lesko says 3 things you can count on in life are death, taxes, and Kirby having a lot of respect for his opponents. That's pretty well the way it goes. Donnie Chester laughing at something I said a little earlier. Donnie, appreciate that. Chris Foster says the Tennessee offensive line's been a pleasant surprise. They stopped Bama's pass rush, made guys non-existent. Also, you go back to the Florida game, good protection there too. Yeah, I mean they're one of the teams in contention for the Joe Moore Award right now. Darnell Wright's a big name there. That's a group that's played pretty well. And, I said this yesterday, it may be an oversimplification, but I believe that the offensive line between Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, I guess you can put Ole Miss in that group too, of those 4 SEC teams that are currently in contention for the SEC championship, the offensive line that plays the best down the stretch is probably the group that leads its team to the league title, I believe. And if you want to know why Tennessee's right now ranked higher than folks thought they would be, beating Alabama when most folks, at least at the beginning of the year, thought they wouldn't, performance of the offensive line is one of the reasons why. Connor Hill says, are you more impressed this year or last year with the Dogs' play? I think for me, there was probably more for Georgia to prove last year. Because here's the one thing you got to remember, Connor, is that in 2021 to begin the season, the actual overall mood around Georgia wasn't necessarily all that positive. Now, listen, Georgia's one of these places where the fan base is large enough. There's always going to be a huge portion for whom hope is going to spring eternal, and every new year brings new hope. But Georgia was coming back in 2021 after having not won the division in 2020. And Georgia had kind of, by appearances, been a team that had kind of trended down for a couple of years. The only person last year that I think in the national media or sort of the, beyond DawgNation media that we can think of that picked Georgia to win the national championship was probably Peter Burns. In fact, we brought him on the show for that very reason, because he was one of the few guys making the case for Georgia. So there's no doubt that Georgia impressed, I would say, more last year, kind of showing that it wasn't what it appeared to be in the very weird year of pandemic 2020, that it was a nationally elite program. In fact, it was actually taking a big step forward. So last year, I think you proved more, and this year has really been more about just kind of maintaining that. Now, I think that there were more people giving credit to Georgia during the season last year for how good it is, whereas right now, I think even among some Georgia fans, I don't think they quite realize that this is what excellent football looks like. That there's this picture in your mind of domination that's like more thorough than what Georgia's currently doing. But in real life, there really isn't a lot of actual tangible examples of teams being more dominant than what Georgia is right now. You close your eyes, it sort of seems like it should be more, but in reality, you can't really find an example of a team who's doing it in a more thorough way than Georgia's doing it. So that's, to me, the difference between this year's team and last year's team. And Connor says, is this year's Georgia team impressing you like last year's team did? Terence Edwards brought up the one thing. The only thing that this year's team's not doing that last year's teams did, in my mind, is getting after the quarterback. If they can find a way to get after the quarterback, this year will be like last year, whether they have 5 first-round defensive players or not. They got to find a way to get the quarterback. They just got to find a way to get the quarterback. And so that's the one difference here right now. RT367, thanks for the kind words. Appreciate that. And then finally, one more here at DawgNation.com. All right. Anything else? All right, we're going to go. Thanks for everybody for being here. Check out the AJC online, ajc.com. Great way to go and stay up to date on everything happening. Baseball playoffs roll on without the Atlanta Braves. You can kind of follow that if you'd like to. Falcons, important football games now. Arthur Smith's got that team playing pretty well. You can get more information on all of that. We're getting close to the election. We don't talk about that here, but there's plenty going on with that. You can find out all that. Hawks got a win to begin the campaign. So pretty good stuff there, too. Also, if you're an AJC subscriber, you can get some bonus Hawks content covering that team. So it's a great incentive to you for becoming an AJC subscriber. And at ajc.com, you can learn more about that. And by the way, don't forget this. We're not Tech fans, of course, but we do like college football on Thursdays. And Tech plays Virginia tonight. So if you've been frustrated by the horrible state of Thursday night football in the NFL, last week you had JT playing against, was it Baylor? Yeah, so you had a pretty fun Thursday night game last week. And Tech, I believe, is actually a slight favorite against Virginia because the Cavaliers are terrible. But Tech looking to get its 3rd consecutive win under interim coach Brent Key. So my son's got his last baseball game tonight, so I'll be doing some of that. But my football attention is going to probably be more on Tech Virginia than it will be on whatever Thursday night game is taking place on the streamer. So there you go on that front. By the way, R.S. Andrews, I mentioned the R.S. Andrews Go With The Flow. That's coming up Friday night on the DawgNation video channels. You can find R.S. Andrews online at rsandrews.com. Dari's great at picking games, but he's also great, he and his entire team, of taking care of you for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. It was toasty warm in my house this morning because that heating system was cranking it out because it was cold on the outside. So if your heating system not doing what it's supposed to be doing, then trust our friends at RS Andrews, and they'll take care of you on that today. Find them online, rsandrews.com. We'll see you tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. We'll look forward to talking to you then, everybody.